History often hides its filth behind golden crowns. We imagine kings and queens as powerful, living in luxury, surrounded by silk and gold. But behind those palace walls, their deaths were not always glorious. Some were slow, grotesque, and humiliating. When a royal figure died, the whole kingdom watched. Sometimes it was a private sickness that turned the body into a horror story. Other times, it was a public spectacle that shocked even loyal subjects. This story is not about battles won or empires built. It is about the dark truth of how royals people seen as untouchable. Met ends so disgusting, they became legends of shame. Imagine a king rotting alive while still breathing, or a queen's body filled with parasites that ate her from within. These deaths remind us that no amount of wealth or power could protect them from pain. In ancient courts, the death of a ruler was often turned into a performance. Doctors were summoned, rituals were done, and sometimes prayers echoed through palaces as the king lay dying. Yet none of it mattered when the disease was beyond cure. Sometimes the royal family even tried to hide the true cause, embarrassed by how horrifying it was. But whispers always spread, and soon the whole kingdom knew. This list of 5 royals is not for the faint-hearted. Each one died in a way that left people horrified. Their deaths were not noble but filthy, painful, and unforgettable. From exploding stomachs to worms crawling under the skin, these stories will show how death did not care about thrones. We will travel through centuries, across kingdoms, and look at how some of the most powerful people in history met, ends that no one could envy. These stories are not just about death, but about the human body's limits, and how even royalty could not escape decay, infection, or humiliation. The question is, what does it mean when the most powerful person in the land cannot even die with dignity? Now, let us begin with our first royal, a king whose death shocked Europe when his body literally burst open during burial. Some deaths in royal history are so strange they almost sound like a joke, but this one was all too real. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, often remembered as the king who ate himself to death, holds a place in history for the most grotesque reason imaginable. It was February 12, 1771. The king sat down for what would become his final meal. This wasn't just a simple dinner, it was a royal feast that spiraled into excess. Reports describe a shocking menu: lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and then the dessert. Not 1 or 2 pastries, but 14 servings of his favorite semla buns, soaked in hot milk and stuffed with marzipan. His greed for food knew no bounds that evening. At first it might have seemed amusing, a king indulging in his pleasures, filling the table with more than anyone could ever finish. But within hours, laughter turned into horror. The king doubled over in pain, clutching his stomach. He couldn't breathe properly, his body overwhelmed by the sheer volume of food. Servants rushed in, but there was nothing they could do. The feast that had brought him joy now crushed him from within. By nightfall, the king of Sweden was dead taken, not by sword, disease, or poison, but by his own appetite. The shock rippled across Europe. Here was a ruler who controlled armies, lands, and laws, yet couldn't control his hunger. His death became infamous, almost comical, but also deeply tragic. It exposed the darker side of royal privilege, how indulgence, left unchecked, could destroy even those who lived in the grandest palaces. While other monarchs met their end in battle or political plots, Adolf Frederick's gluttonous demise stood apart. It became a warning, whispered in courts across the continent. Power can't protect you from yourself. And yet, as bizarre as his death was, another royal's end would be far more gruesome one that left not just disgust, but also terror in the hearts of all who witnessed it. Among the strangest and most undignified royal deaths in history is that of King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. He is often remembered not for his reign, but for the way his life came to an end through a feast so excessive that it killed him. His story is both grotesque and absurd, a reminder that even kings, with all their riches, could fall victim to their own appetites. Adolf Frederick ruled Sweden during the mid-18th century, but his role was largely ceremonial. Real power rested in the Swedish parliament, and his influence was limited. Still, he enjoyed the luxuries of royalty, and one of his greatest pleasures was food. He was known as a man who could never resist a grand meal, especially traditional Swedish dishes. But his final dinner would go far beyond any ordinary indulgence. On February 12, 1771, the king sat down to a massive feast. The meal included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, and an endless supply of champagne. But the centerpiece of his deadly dinner was semla, a rich pastry filled with almond paste and topped with cream, served in bowls of hot milk. The king adored semla, and that night he did not stop at one or two. According to reports, he consumed 14 servings of the pastry, each floating in warm milk, after already stuffing himself with heavy foods. The sheer volume of food was staggering. His stomach, already strained, could not handle the enormous intake. Soon after the feast, Adolf Frederick began to suffer from violent stomach cramps, difficulty breathing, and eventually collapsed. Physicians were called, but nothing could be done. The king, who had lived a comfortable life of wealth and indulgence, died that very night, not from war or poison, but from overeating. The scandal of his death spread quickly. For centuries, kings had been remembered as warriors, conquerors, or victims of palace intrigue. But Adolf Frederick became known as the king who ate himself to death. His passing was often mocked in history books and even in classrooms, reducing a monarch's life to the tale of his final gluttony. It is a disturbing reminder of how wealth and indulgence can sometimes destroy the very people who enjoy them. Surrounded by riches and luxuries, Adolf Frederick could command anything except moderation. His death, grotesque in its absurdity, showed the world that even royalty could die in ways unworthy of their crown. But this is not the only strange and revolting royal death. In the next part, we'll see how a powerful Byzantine emperor's obsession with medicine and herbs would lead him to one of the most horrifying ends in history. King George V of Britain, the grandfather of Queen Elizabeth II, lived a life wrapped in ceremony, dignity, and the burdens of empire. Yet his death in 1936 was anything but natural. It was a dark secret of the royal household that only emerged decades later, and it left a stain on the monarchy's history. Unlike other royals who died from diseases or terrible accidents, George's death was not just a matter of fate. It was managed, timed, and delivered by those closest to him. By the mid-1930s, George's health had rapidly declined. Years of smoking had ruined his lungs, and he suffered from chronic bronchitis. He was weak, often bedridden, and unable to carry out his royal duties. But what made his end disturbing was not the sickness itself. It was how his doctors chose to end it. On the night of January 20th, 1936, King George was fading. The royal family gathered in Sandringham, prepared for the inevitable. But his personal physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, made a chilling decision. Instead of letting the king die naturally, he administered 2 massive injections, one of morphine and one of cocaine. The dose was lethal, far beyond any medical justification. It was, in plain words, a royal euthanasia. Why? Dawson later admitted he did it so George's death would be announced in the dignified morning edition of the Times, rather than the less appropriate evening papers. The king's passing was carefully staged, not for his comfort, not for his family, but for the sake of public image. The death of a monarch had become a performance, controlled to the very last breath. The people never knew at the time. Officially, the announcement was simple. King George V had passed peacefully in his sleep. But Dawson's own diary, discovered years later, revealed the truth. The king was effectively killed, not by his disease, but by the deliberate act of his physician. The revelation shocked historians and the public alike. It raised disturbing questions about power, dignity, and the control of narratives in royal life. Was it mercy, sparing George from suffering? Or was it manipulation, prioritizing headlines over human life? To this day, it remains one of the most unsettling royal deaths, not because of gore or disease, but because of the cold calculation behind it. King George V's final moments showed how even in death, royals were bound not by freedom, but by the weight of monarchy and image. It was a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing deaths are not the most violent, but the most controlled. If there was ever a king remembered for one of the most bizarre and frankly disgusting deaths in history, it was King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. His reign in the 18th century was not marked by remarkable achievements or great wars. but instead by the manner of his death. It earned him the odd nickname, the king who ate himself to death. On the day of his final feast in 1771, the king sat down to what began as a celebratory meal. But this wasn't just any meal, it turned into a marathon of gluttony. He started with lobster, caviar, kippers, sauerkraut, and meats dripping with fat. After washing it all down with champagne, he was still not satisfied. Then came dessert, and this is where the story became infamous. The king consumed 14 servings of semla sweet bun, filled with almond paste and drowned in hot milk. Even as his stomach was already stretched beyond comfort, he could not stop himself. One servant later wrote that his appetite seemed to have no end, as though the king was racing against his own body. But the body always wins. Within hours, the king suffered severe stomach cramps. His breathing grew shallow, and his face turned pale. Despite frantic efforts by his attendants, the pressure of undigested food overwhelmed his system. The man who had ruled Sweden died in his bed, not by sword or by poison, but because he simply couldn't resist another bite. Historians sometimes tell this story with humor, but there's a darker lesson behind it. In a time when famine often haunted peasants and food was scarce for common people, their king died from excess's last act, an obscene display of gluttony. It wasn't just a personal failure of self-control, it became a grotesque symbol of the disconnect between rulers and those they governed. King Adolf Frederick's death was written in history as both shocking and absurd. Yet the detail of his last meal, recorded carefully in documents, ensures that his name is remembered not for royal accomplishments, but for one of the most embarrassing and revolting exits ever seen in royalty. And if this feels unsettling, wait until you hear about another royal whose death was even worse ending, not in luxury, but in total humiliation. King Henry I of England, son of William the Conqueror, met one of the most bizarre and revolting deaths in royal history. Known as a strong ruler and the founder of a more centralized English monarchy, Henry lived with power and dignity, and his end was anything but dignified. Henry had a notorious appetite, particularly for lampreys, slimy, eel-like fish, considered a delicacy in medieval courts. His doctors had warned him repeatedly to stay away from them as they upset his health. But Henry, stubborn and proud, dismissed the advice. In 1135, after a large hunting expedition in Normandy, he indulged in a massive feast. At the center of the table were the lampreys he so dearly loved. He ate them in excess, ignoring the sickness rising within him. According to chroniclers, his insides seemed to revolt against the very food he had adored. For days he lingered in unbearable pain, his body deteriorating from what his doctors described as a surfeit of lampreys. The irony was sharp. A king who ruled with an iron hand was undone not by war or treachery, but by his own stubborn indulgence. Chroniclers painted the scene as grotesque, a powerful monarch reduced to groans and vomiting, helpless against the slimy creatures he refused to give up. His death shocked his court, not because it was sudden, but because it was so undignified. The aftermath was disastrous. Henry's death, without a clear heir, sparked a bloody civil war known as the Anarchy. His gluttony not only ended his own life in a humiliating way, but also plunged his kingdom into years of chaos and suffering. Henry's story reminds us how the smallest weaknesses, ignored in arrogance, can destroy even the mightiest rulers. His craving for lampreys became more than a dietary preference. It became his downfall, and one of the most disgusting deaths in royal history. But Henry was not the only monarch whose death shocked the world. Another king would meet his end in a way so grotesque that it turned him into a cautionary tale for centuries. The death of King James I of Scotland in 1437 was not only brutal, but humiliating. He was a strong ruler, often feared for his iron grip on the nobles who constantly plotted against him. His attempt to strengthen the crown came at a price: resentment, and eventually betrayal. James believed he had control, but his enemies were always waiting for the right moment. One cold night, assassins led by Sir Robert Graham stormed the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, where the king was staying. Hearing the commotion, James tried to escape, but fate had other plans. The exit route that could have saved him had been blocked earlier by his own orders. Months before, he had commanded the sewer passage leading from his chambers to be sealed, to prevent tennis balls from rolling inside. That single decision sealed his fate, Trapped inside his own chamber with nowhere to run, James tried to fight, but he was outnumbered. The assassins dragged him to the ground and stabbed him repeatedly around 16 times. His screams echoed in the night, but help never came in time. His queen Joan fought desperately to defend him, even taking a sword and injuring some attackers. But it was useless. By morning, the King of Scotland was dead, killed not in battle, but like prey in a corner. The sheer irony of his death, caused by his own earlier order to seal the escape route, haunted Scotland. His people saw it as both tragedy and divine punishment, depending on which side of his rule they stood. What made his death so infamous was not just the brutality, but the humiliating way he was trapped. A king reduced to a man cornered like an animal, slaughtered by his enemies. It was a grim reminder that power alone could not protect even the mightiest rulers from betrayal, nor from the smallest decisions that could decide their fate. James' story closes the list of royals who died in the most disgusting, humiliating, and shocking ways. It's a reflection of the dark and brutal side of monarchy. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden holds one of the strangest and most grotesque royal death records in history. Known as the king who ate himself to death, his end was as absurd as it was revolting. On February 12, 1771, the Swedish monarch sat down for what was supposed to be a celebratory feast. What followed, however, became one of the most infamous meals ever recorded. The king's banquet was excessive, even by royal standards. He consumed massive amounts of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and meats. But the true cause of his downfall came with dessert, an unbelievable 14 servings of semla, a sweet pastry filled with almond paste and drowned in hot milk. Instead of stopping, he continued to indulge, almost as though he believed his royal body was immune to human limits. By the end of the night, the king suffered violent stomach cramps, bloating, and shortness of breath. His body could no longer handle the strain of digestion. He collapsed in his chambers, surrounded not by advisors or priests, but by the overwhelming stench of food and his own suffering. Despite the efforts of court doctors, King Adolf Frederick died that night, leaving Sweden without a ruler. His death became both a national tragedy and a grim joke across Europe. Foreign courts mocked him as a glutton, while his people mourned an oddly undignified end to a monarch who otherwise had been seen as kind and gentle. The irony was brutal. While many of his subjects lived on meager bread and soup, their king literally ate himself to death on the finest luxuries. This bizarre passing revealed the excesses of the royal lifestyle. For ordinary citizens, it was a disturbing reminder of the gulf between the suffering of the common people and the indulgence of those who ruled them. Instead of dying heroically in battle or in grand ceremonies, King Adolf Frederick's legacy was forever sealed by gluttony. His death was so infamous that Swedish history books still teach children about the king who ate too much. It remains one of the most grotesque yet oddly humiliating royal deaths. A monarch remembered not for power or conquest, but for his inability to control his appetite. Across centuries, royal families built their image around divinity, beauty, and untouchable power. They wanted subjects to believe they were chosen by heaven itself. Yet their deaths revealed something far different. Not grace, not dignity, but often decay, disease, and unbearable suffering. What was hidden inside the palace walls became exposed in the most humiliating ways. These kings and queens were surrounded by doctors, servants, and wealth beyond imagination. But all the gold in their vaults could not protect them from their own choices or their own bodies. Obsessions with indulgence, greed for excess, and ignorance about medicine led many royals to horrifying ends. The image of glory cracked the moment their bodies betrayed them. History does not remember them for their golden crowns, their grand banquets, or their victories. Instead, it remembers their slow rotting, their unbearable pain, and the grotesque conditions of their final days. It is a reminder that no throne, no crown, and no bloodline can escape the natural law of mortality. The lesson is brutal but clear. Behind every display of majesty, there is a human body vulnerable, fragile, and destined for decay. The royals tried to cover it with jewels and silk, but death stripped it all away. Their disgusting ends were not just accidents of fate, were symbols of their excess, their arrogance, and sometimes their punishment. And so, centuries later, people no longer whisper about their power, but instead shudder at the way they died. That is the true legacy of royalty, not immortality, but a reminder of the darkest and most humiliating truths of the human condition.